power, and when we try to demonstrate and model what righteous power can look like, what loving power can look like, a lot of times that gets really difficult when we get into issues of gender, issues of identity, right? Not everybody is, even within our community, is deemed to have equal worth when it comes to talking about Black power, right? So just from that kind of gender and identity perspective and the ways that intersects with our discussions around power and Black power, what are your thoughts in the ways that we're getting it right and the ways that we're not getting it right? And are brothers doing enough in this space around this whole discussion of like deconstructing power and gender roles and identity? Are we doing enough?
I mean, I think we're never doing enough. I think as long as there are dynamics that privilege some over the others, that we're never doing enough. Now, we're constantly working to get better because we're human. And I think we have to be realistic about that. And then we have to be focused on what does it mean to constantly dismantle systems of hierarchy and privilege and culture, while recognizing that like hierarchies inside of an institution are helpful to get things done. There are all sorts of ways in which we have to be able to hold multiple complications as it relates to movement building and to building and unlocking sort of more opportunity, more freedom, more equity. There's a great article that Angela Glover Blackwell wrote in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. I'm going to nerd out for a second on something that a lot of folks in our advocacy world know as the curb effect. And the curb effect, she talks about in the article, basically leverages this story of Berkeley area activists. I think in the 70s, disability justice advocates fought and got a curb in the sidewalk as one of the first curbs the sidewalk for folks who are differently able. And that curb unlocked so many other people's ability to move, right? It made it easier for carriages, for children. It made it easier for people moving packages. It helped a whole set of other people. And when you sort of think about setting policy, building society, building space with those who are most impacted, oftentimes those who are most invisible in mind, you have the ability to unlock so much potential. I think about what has the relationship recognition work that the LGBT movement done unlock so many spaces for people to have all different types of relationship recognition, right? For years, in the earlier days of that movement, the domestic partnerships that seniors were able to get in later in their lives to protect their assets, all sorts of things. When we think about things like universal health care, right? And how it can unlock potential for so many others, debt-free college education, universal benefits that actually allow all of us to fully participate. And so I think about that, and I think about intersectionality a lot as a out Black gay man who's doing this work unapologetically for the most part when I'm at my best. And sometimes a little apologetically when I'm just being human and dealing with a world around me that has expectations, demands, and isms that impact me. All of those things are sort of baked in and weaved in to our work. And I think if we don't bring our full selves to the table, I think we prevent the sort of beauty and opportunity that can be achieved when we kind of tap into everything that we can bring. We are in a new era where more and more people want to be visible, want to be heard, want to be counted, and want to do so on their own terms. And I think that so many of the structures and the systems that were built and the systems that we use were not designed for that. Everything from how our democracy is set up, right? From how we design single member districts to how we design some of our advocacy organizations and design the structures to how we leverage things like a 501c3 and 501c. All of these things are structures that are not always designed to unlock a kind of multiracial, deeply diverse from gender and community, so many other perspectives. And so in our efforts to build more equity, to, I think, unlock more freedom and more joy, we have to be willing to dismantle the structures that we've held on to, because sometimes those structures are the very things getting us in the way of truly achieving things. And it's not simply about being included in a system, but about building a system that really allows full inclusion.
Amen. Ashe. I want to get to the last question, which is a question about how do we know when we're getting closer to Black power? But before that, I'd be remiss if I didn't throw in a question about civil disobedience, because you're one of the brothers who I reached out to a few weeks ago as we've been fighting this this fight against voter suppression and the fight for voting rights. And we were trying to do a Brothers' Day of Action, civil disobedience, to deliver a message to the Senate about the filibuster and about our voting rights. And you answered the call without hesitation and came with us and spoke and locked arms, and we got arrested together. And there's been a lot I've been saying a lot about, and other people have, about the role of civil disobedience. And sometimes people view some of those tactics as being in contrast to or separate from the messaging and the digital role that you often in Color of Change is often playing, or some of the corporate accountability. How do you see the intersection of these strategies? Civil disobedience, corporate accountability, digital outreach. How do you see these things playing together to build power?
I think that we will always lose in the back rooms of Congress or corporate boardrooms if we do not have the people lined up at the front door. And one of the reasons why I think civil disobedience is so important is because we have to create the space to get more people to see what's happening, to pay attention, to unlock people's outrage and their energy around advocacy. And so to the extent that our ability to get more people's attention can be spurred through civil disobedience, then I think that was something that I was encouraged to be part of. Part of the work that we do at Color of Change is getting as many people engaged and then helping to direct those people in the most strategic ways possible. And one kind of strategic lever that we have to pull is the lever of people power and the lever of like people engagement and people mobilization. And so I gotta just say, I appreciate your leadership and you bringing us all together. Someone's got to make that phone call and ask people to engage. And I was happy to accept it, but I wouldn't have been there if you didn't call. And so to the extent that, it takes all of us and it takes our willingness to be able to work together. And so your leadership obviously was so critical, and not just on that, but on so many issues that we're facing. And of course, the kind of really clear issue of our time, which is our ability to express our will for a better future through the vote.
Last question, because we got to be able to figure out when we're getting there and how close we are. How do we know when we're getting closer to Black power? How do we know that it's working?
I think I talk about Color of Change as being an organization that works to create a more human and less hostile world for Black people and all people, because when Black people win, society moves in the right direction. And so I think like a society, a country that begins to give us the benefit of the doubt, where society can be on our side, where there's more opportunity. I think that absolutely relates to power. That might feel mushy, right? It might feel like cultural, like, oh, well, that's not like a policy, but in so many ways, that is actually, most people are not paying attention to banking policy. They're not paying attention to like the intricacies of drug policy. They're paying attention to like, when I go out into the world, do I have the ability to take care of myself and my family? Do I have a shot at a better tomorrow? And it's our job as advocates to pull those right levers at dealing with the policies and dealing with the practices of those policies and how those policies are implemented and enforced. And all of those things are our job. But on a day-to-day basis for everyday people just want to have as much joy as possible. And Black joy is not the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration, not just what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for. And so in so many ways, like I think, as I relate to power, and I think that power can sometimes feel clinical, I think like what will it mean when this country truly recognizes that we're not asking for help and we're not asking for charity. We are demanding that we be recognized as the protagonist in the American story of voting. And what do I mean by that? I mean that no group of people have fought harder, stood on longer lines, and faced more indignities to vote. And so what is a protagonist in any story? It is the people that you're not trying to help so much as that you are trying to get behind, that you are trying to follow, that you recognize that their winning means that society wins. It means that the story ends up the way that the story is supposed to end up, because we don't want a story at the end where the protagonist loses. And so getting behind the protagonist in the American story of voting and the American story of education and the American story of so many things about what will actually make this country live up to what it should be means getting behind Black people, because when Black people win, society moves in the right direction. And that, for me, is why building power, using power, and sharing power is so critical.
The doors of the church are open. Let's go. Rashad Robinson. That is the perfect place to end it. Rashad Robinson, Color of Change. Thank you so much, brother, for everything that you're doing and sitting down and talking. And I'll be seeing you real soon. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you, brother. Talk to you soon.
What's up, y'all? It's time for this week's Cliff Note. Lots of talk in D.C. and around the country in the political world about infrastructure, right? What's going to happen with the infrastructure bill? What's going to happen with the reconciliation bill, right? What's going to happen with those things in that $3.5 trillion bill that deals with the human nature of infrastructure? And so here's the deal. Last week, they were supposed to vote on it. They were trying to vote on the infrastructure without voting on the budget package, without having an agreement on the budget package, right? Lots of talk around what are the progressives going to do? Are they going to stand their ground? Are they going to hold the line? Are they going to fight to make sure that infrastructure doesn't move forward without the budget bill? Because what we know is once they do that, there ain't going to be no reconciliation, right? We're not stupid. We've been through this before. And the question was, would they hold the line? And what we saw was, and there was a lot of thoughts that, that they wouldn't hold the line, because at the end of the day, there was this risk that, well, if you don't vote for it, then we're going to lose out. We're going to lose out on the infrastructure. And then people will have nothing, right? It's that old story about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good and all that stuff. Oh, you can't risk that because then your constituents aren't going to have any of this stuff, no bridges, no roads, and all of that. And a lot of times this works. Right, which brings us to the lesson about power. One of the most important lessons or aspects about power is knowing when to use it, because sometimes people count on us as progressives as not being willing to use that power because there's so much at risk. When we play this strategy of like standing our ground and using our votes as a block, as leverage, then what people will use against us is at the end of the day, it hurts us more when things don't get done, when things don't get passed. Our communities have a lot more the risk than when some other communities, when the Tea Partiers go out there and they act a fool and they risk stuff, when they risk the debt limit and all these other kinds of things. At the end of the day, when you have and you're fighting to have more, then you've got more room to do that. But when you're fighting for the least of these, when you're fighting for communities that are already marginalized, you don't have as much space. And so some of our opposition counts on that at the end of the day, we won't use the power that we have. We won't use the blocks that we have because we're so afraid about what our communities might lose. Knowing when to use your power and holding the line. And they held the line. And here we are today, still having the chance to link those two bills, having a chance not just for the hard infrastructure, the roads and the bridges, but to have all those things, the child care, the senior care, the health care, all of these things that we need, climate, all of these things that our communities want, right? Which brings us to part 2 of the lesson, which is this. It's easier to know when to use your power when you got the people on your side. There is unity, there is strength in our unity. And as long as we remember that, it gets easier to hold the line. I'm Cliff. That's this week's Cliff Note. Black Power Revisited. Whoa, we back. Join us next week on another episode of Black Power Revisited. Tell a friend, like it, share it, spread the word. Y'all be good. Peace.
This is the hour we stand, this is the hour we fight. Not the hour for cowards, time to fight for our rights. And I ain't running no more, I'm standing 10 toes down. Too much at stake right now, except for blood in the ground. Pick a side, no more, straddling the fence. You either hot or cold, you either bashful or bold. Burn the cliff, be